مساء الخير وأهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من واشنطن أونلاين. قرر البيت الأبيض وبأمر تنفيذي من الرئيس بايدن تمديد حالة الطوارئ في سوريا. بحسب البيت الأبيض فإن الوضع في سوريا ولا سيما الإجراءات التي اتخذتها الحكومة التركية لشن مجموعة من الهجمات العسكرية على شمال شرق سوريا هي أمور تقوض حملة هزيمة تنظيم داعش الإرهابي في العراق وسوريا، أمر أيضا يعرض المدنيين للخطر ويهدد السلم والأمن والاستقرار في المنطقة. فما الذي يعنيه هذا التمديد الجديد؟ وهل يأتي بصلاحيات أكبر للقوات الأمريكية على الأرض في شمال شرق سوريا، لا سيما في ظل تمدد نفوذ هيئة تحرير الشام في مدن خاضعة للسيطرة التركية؟ هذا ما أبحثه مع ضيوفي لحلقة اليوم، وهما السيد ترينتون شوينبورن الخبير في فض النزاعات في منظمة انترناشونال ريفيو، ينضم إلينا من نيويورك. ومن نيويورك أيضا ينضم إلينا السيد ألكسندر ماكيفر المحقق في منظمة سوريون من أجل الحقيقة والعدالة. ابقوا معنا لمتابعة هذه الحلقة. أبدأ هذه الحلقة بالترحيب بضيف السيد ترينتون شوينبورن الخبير في فض النزاعات، ينضم إلينا من نيويورك. أهلا وسهلا بك سيد ترينتون، بعد قرار البيت الأبيض بتمديد حالة الطوارئ بالنسبة لسوريا، يعني ربما النقطة الوحيدة التي جاءت على ذكر سوريا في قرار مجلس أو في تقرير مجلس الأمن القومي الأمريكي للعام 2022 كانت الخشية الأمريكية من التحركات التركية والتهديدات التركية المستمرة بشن عمليات عسكرية في شمال شرق سوريا. يعني يبدو أن هناك ربط بين المخاوف الأمريكية من هذه التهديدات التركية التي تزعزع استقرار حملة مكافحة تنظيم داعش وبين الوجود الأمريكي في شمال شرق سوريا. هل هذا يعني أن مسألة التواجد الأمريكي في شمال شرق سوريا أصبحت أمر مستقر وممكن أن يستمر على المدى الطويل؟
So ultimately, our goal in Syria really hasn't changed over the past years. Obviously, the situation on the ground has remained fairly stable ever since the last Turkish military operation. The displacement of people from the affected area, the Peace Spring area, obviously has not been fixed or redressed, but the military situation has cooled down, and the U.S. counterinsurgency strategy with regards to the Islamic State or the remnants of the Islamic State hasn't changed significantly. And regardless of what the White House says, the situation on the ground is really what's going to dictate what stance the U.S. takes and also what the U.S. does with regards to other actors in the region. So even if Turkey takes another military operation, begins another attack somewhere, uh, outside of potential diplomatic consequences, I don't see the U.S. presence in Syria changing significantly. The priority for our military presence there is continued counterinsurgency, and partnering with the SDF is part of that. So when it comes to a Turkish operation, if it were to come in, say, Manbij or Jarablus, I don't see any real impact coming out of that. If there were to be an operation in Hasake or Kobani, that might change the calculus. But again, it really depends on what the target is and how big that operation would be.
ذكرت أن الوضع العسكري على الأرض في سوريا هو ما يفرض على الولايات المتحدة سياساتها واستراتيجيتها، تحديدا العسكرية المتعلقة بالتواجد الأمريكي في شمال شرق سوريا. ولكن ألا ترى أن التغيرات السياسية أيضا هنا داخل أمريكا، إقبالنا على انتخابات قريبة في الكونغرس الأمريكي الشهر المقبل، ممكن أن يلعب دور أيضا في إعادة صياغة السياسات الأمريكية تجاه الملف السوري؟
So there's obviously been a big shift in foreign policy opinions here to Ukraine, seeing as the war in Ukraine is a larger and also more pressing crisis at the time. But there is a desire, at least, if not a remaining interest, to continue devoting resources to counterinsurgency against ISIS. With regards to the Assad regime, there has been sort of a quiet in Washington, I would say. I'm not sure what the best term would be, but you may notice that the rhetoric has shifted ever since Obama left office and into the Trump administration. The rhetoric about removing Assad, about making sure Assad cannot destroy his people, destroy his land, uh, use weapons of mass destruction like chemical weapons, that rhetoric has changed. And now it's been replaced by a sort of silence from Washington. You really don't hear that line anymore. You don't hear anything like Obama's red line speech in 2013. I wouldn't necessarily say that that suggests that the White House is ready to accept Assad or normalize relations with Damascus. I think it's more of a middle ground in that the White House is looking to see what regional partners in the region are going to do vis-a-vis Damascus. And by regional partners, I primarily mean Jordania, the Jordanian government, the Saudis, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates. And in these countries, with the exception of Jordan, you are seeing a trend of normalization with Assad. You're seeing
Mhm.
embassies being reopened, communications being reestablished. The hostile rhetorical stance that these countries took previously, you don't see that anymore. Whether or
Yes,
not the US will toe to that, I'm not sure, but there is a change ongoing.
لاعب سياسي آخر مهم في الساحة السياسية السورية وهو تركيا يتحدث عن خطوات نحو التطبيع المحتمل مع دمشق، يعني مقابل ذلك الولايات المتحدة تصريحاتها في وارد آخر تماما تصر على أن يكون هناك عملية انتقال سياسي على محاسبة ما تسميهم بمجرمي الحرب من الحكومة السورية. ولكن هل هذا الخطاب الأمريكي الذي يتكرر حتى لو أصبح وقوف في المنتصف ابتعاد نوعا ما عن سياسات أوباما وسياسات الخط الأحمر ممكن أن تفيد أو تساعد الشعب السوري، ممكن أن تؤدي فعلا إلى عملية انتقال سياسي؟
When you talk about political transition, the first question I would ask is transition to who? Who would be the new administration? Who would be in charge? What would the cabinet be? What would the ministries look like afterwards? And there really aren't answers to these questions, not that I'm aware of. And that's because the opposition in Syria doesn't have the ability to really take on that kind of transition, not anymore. If we were talking about this 10 years ago, my answer would be different and probably more optimistic. But the fact is, the rebellion, for what it's worth, I would say the revolution lives on, but the rebellion has failed militarily. And if you don't have the military strength to back up that kind of transition, with a power like the Assad regime, the way it operates based on force, you're not going to be able to force that kind of transition. It's just not going to happen now or even in the short term. So it very much feels like empty rhetoric that's designed to make the United States look like it's remaining active when there's really no serious progress that could be made towards that kind of policy. And I haven't talked about Iran yet. That's partially because it's a very complicated topic, and the problems and the controversy with the JCPOA go back years, but Iranian support to Damascus has not changed ever since they became involved in the war. And that is still a big sticking point for the US in particular because of our diplomatic stance towards Iran. So even if there were a plan being drafted for some kind of normalization or, on the other hand, a political transition, it's going to be complicated because of how deeply involved the Iranian state is in Syrian affairs.
هل يكون التركيز الغربي اليوم على مواجهة روسيا في أوكرانيا بداية لرفض النفوذ الروسي أيضا في الشرق الأوسط، ومن ضمن ذلك طبعا البصمة الروسية الكبيرة في سوريا؟ هل ممكن أن نرى تغير في السياسات الأمريكية تجاه الوجود الروسي في سوريا؟
If there were a change in the way that the US addressed Russia and Syria, I believe we would have seen it by now. There hasn't really been any change on the ground. In the Northeast, in Hasake, patrols are still ongoing, both by Russian and US forces, and there haven't been any incidents between them. And there really hasn't been any rhetoric either from the Pentagon or the White House suggesting that they will take a more aggressive stance towards Russia and Syria or interfere with Russian operations in Syria. And really, um, I would say there is very little spillover from what's happening in Ukraine and Syria, at least in this specific instance where we're talking about the US and Russia. Could that change? Certainly, but I don't see either power really having the interest in doing that. There is certainly a desire in some more hardline military groups to increase tension or escalate, and you will see this especially in Russian rhetoric. But on the ground, nothing has really changed, and uh, it's been 8 months, coming up on 9 months pretty soon, and it's just if there hasn't been something by this point, then I don't expect the situation will change dramatically.
إذا أنت تقول أن أي رد أمريكي على العدوان التركي على سوريا سيكون فقط رد دبلوماسي لا أكثر. هل هذا يبرر اليوم السكوت الأمريكي على تحركات المسيرات التركية، هجمات المسيرات التركية الدرونز التي تستهدف قياديين في قيادات بعضها يقاتل جنبا إلى جنب مع التحالف الدولي في مهمة مكافحة تنظيم داعش؟
Yeah, this is always a very interesting point to bring up because ostensibly the SDF is a partner force, and nominally they are an auxiliary force for the US military. We've worked with them for years. We supply them with resources, both material and personnel. We support counterinsurgency operations. We've developed their Hezbollah anti-terror forces, their specific counterinsurgent forces. So you would think that the US would take a more active stance towards defending and supporting them. But um, the calculus, in my opinion, really leans more towards taking a neutral stance towards Turkish action unless it's egregious. And what would an egregious action be? Probably a larger scale operation that would threaten SDF power bases in Hasake, Kobani, Kamishlu. But Turkey is still a NATO partner. That is a fact, and that's a fact that I don't expect to change anytime soon. And as long as that's a fact, the Pentagon has to sort of balance that out and accept that they have to let Turkey take some level of operation against the SDF. Otherwise, they risk that relationship. And in that calculus, it is a more important relationship because a Turkish withdrawal from NATO would have major diplomatic and military repercussions. And especially at this point in time where NATO is so engaged in the conflict in Ukraine, it would be a very, very difficult withdrawal to deal with.
بسبب أهمية الشراكة الأمريكية التركية في إطار حلف الناتو مثل ما ذكرت، واشنطن قبلت بواقع ضم أو احتلال تركيا لأراضي ومناطق في شمال سوريا، ولكن ألا تتغير هذه المعادلة؟ ألا تتغير المواقف الأمريكية تجاه المناطق المسيطر عليها تركيا في الشمال السوري بعد التحركات الأخيرة لهيئة تحرير الشام أو جبهة النصرة أو الفرع السوري من تنظيم القاعدة وتمددها في مناطق خاضعة للسيطرة التركية؟
So first and foremost, HTS does remain a designated foreign terrorist organization under U.S. State Department uh, legislation. So that in and of itself is potential for some kind of action. Now, what kind of action? That's really the big question here. And the big question that I would ask is, what would Afrin look like if there were to be some kind of military operation that would expel HTS? All of a sudden, you're looking at the SDF back on the Turkish border in a place where they haven't had a real administrative or practical presence for 4 years. All of a sudden, for Ankara, that's a crisis. For Turkey, that's a crisis. For the United States, it would almost be, it wouldn't change anything on the ground for them, but it certainly would change the reality of the situation in the north for Turkey. And that brings me back to the point of Turkey would see that as a crisis and would say, why did you do this? Why did you let this happen? This is a problem for us. And then you get back to that issue of, well, what if they threaten to withdraw from NATO? What if they threaten to do X, Y, or Z? It's ultimately, I don't see an operation in Afrin happening. And granted, what has happened in Afrin has happened very fast. It's only been 3 days, and it's also a bit unprecedented. Um, no one really expected HTS to be as bold as they were. They did enter Afrin back in June of 2022, and they went as far north as Ain Dara, but they pulled back when Turkish authorities requested that they do, and that seemed like the end of it. So this most recent episode has been quite surprising in that it seems like HTS acted opportunistically. They seized an opportunity to implant themselves in an area where they had never had presence before, and Turkey hasn't really reacted yet. Certainly, they've been active behind the scenes, but to what degree is still a big question. And it's very much up in the air as there's fighting still ongoing at this moment.
هناك أصوات تؤيد مسألة تغيير الأسماء وتغيير الصورة الخارجية التي قامت بها جبهة النصرة، يعني الذي أصبح اسمها اليوم هيئة تحرير الشام. أصوات تقول وتحاول إقناع الحكومة الأمريكية بأن هيئة تحرير الشام لم تعد مصدرة للإرهاب الدولي المرتبط بتنظيم القاعدة. هل ممكن أن تلقى مثل هذه الأصوات أذان صاغية لدى البيت الأبيض ويكون هناك مواقف يعني أمريكية تقبل فعلا بنفوذ هيئة تحرير الشام المتمدد في الشمال السوري؟
So, HTS, looking back at HTS's past, it's clear that there is indeed a divide between them and Al Qaeda. Going back to 2018, HTS began to purge certain elements from their ranks. That would be primarily the Huras ad-Din group, which is also a designated terror organization, and to a lesser degree, groups like Ansar al-Islam and Latakia, Ansar al-Turkestani, and over the course of 2 years, these purges really had an impact in that these groups were almost completely severed from HTS militarily and administratively. So they do still exist in Idlib, but they exist as fringe groups. So they really don't have popular support. They aren't really given any resources or salaries by HTS. And HTS has made it very clear that they're not willing to rebuild that relationship. So, do I think that HTS still has really viable connections to Al Qaeda? No. But do I think that they could be considered a partner? Also, no. It's been very evident that they rule in a very authoritative manner. Freedom of speech and freedom of press are very restricted in Idlib still. They have had issues in the past with suppression of human rights, suppression of particularly the rights of demonstrators who are arrested and detained unjustly. And so ultimately, the question would be, they may not necessarily have the designation of a foreign terrorist group anymore, but that doesn't make them a viable partner or someone that we should engage with openly. Instead, we should be cautious in terms of foreign policy as to how we go about engaging with them and treating them.
شكرا جزيلا لك ضيفي السيد ترينتون شوينبورن، كنت معنا من نيويورك. وأنتقل الآن معكم متابعينا أيضا إلى نيويورك مرة أخرى عبر سكايب. ينضم إلينا السيد ألكسندر ماكيفر المحقق في منظمة سوريون لأجل العدالة. أهلا وسهلا بك سيد ألكسندر. رأينا هيئة تحرير الشام تقوم بعدة هجمات في السابق، عدة محاولات لأخذ مناطق تسيطر عليها المعارضة المدعومة تركيا، ولكن هجوم اليوم بإجماع المراقبين هو هجوم غير مسبوق، أكبر من أي هجوم سابق لهيئة تحرير الشام على مناطق ما يسمى بالجيش الوطني السوري المدعوم تركيا. لماذا الآن؟ ما هي العوامل التي تدفع هيئة تحرير الشام لمثل هذا الهجوم واسع النطاق هذه المرة؟
So I think it's clear that HTS is interested in expanding from Idlib and the surrounding areas into northern Aleppo, into Afrin, into the Euphrates Shield territories, and they've had this interest for a long time. They earlier in the year and previously they'd sent some officials to go meet with SNA, the Syrian National Army officials, to try to negotiate some sort of bigger role for them in the region. And then in June, we saw a similar but smaller scale incident that similar to this that with them sending military convoys into Afrin. But this time, they took advantage of the divisions within the Syrian National Army, largely between Farqat al-Hamza and the Third Legion, which is made up primarily of al-Jabha Shamiya. And so there was fighting that broke out after the assassination of the media activist known as Abu Ghanem. And HTS took this opportunity to move into Afrin, sent to deploy military convoys in support of Farqat al-Hamza, and then also in alliance with Suleiman Shah or Amshad. This I think it was sort of a long time coming that we'd see a more aggressive policy by HTS in regards to Afrin.
إلى أي مدى ممكن أن تذهب تركيا في محاولتها التدخل لفض هذا النزاع السوري بين هيئة تحرير الشام وبين القوات التي دعمتها ودربتها تركيا؟ وألا ترى أن الضربات الروسية الأخيرة على مناطق السيطرة التركية هي بمثابة تنبيهات وتحذيرات روسية للجانب التركي ليتدخل وينهي تمدد هيئة تحرير الشام في الشمال السوري؟
So I think Turkey really does not want to involve itself militarily in these conflicts between the opposition groups, because that would be very risky, I think, for Turkey to openly fight against HTS or to fight against the Third Legion. So I think Turkey is mostly trying to negotiate between the factions behind the scenes and try to come to some sort of agreement. I think it is in Turkey's interest to keep HTS in Idlib because it has a better relationship with the SNA groups. They're more direct proxies than HTS is. So I do think that Turkey doesn't want HTS in Afrin, but it is willing to negotiate because it's not willing to openly fight against HTS. As for the role of Russia, I'm not quite sure what's going on there. The relationship between Russia and Turkey is very transactional, and it's at times it's hard to really get a read on what's going to happen. But during the last couple of days, we have seen Russian airstrikes in Afrin targeting opposition groups. So I think they're maybe I think we'll probably see more of these, but I don't think it's going to be very large scale, not comparable to Idlib. But I think also Russia doesn't want to see HTS expand, but at the same time, it could be an opportunity for Russia because it would weaken the opposition that's perhaps more seen as more legitimate by the international community, the SNA rather than HTS.
ألكسندر، نرى هيئة تحرير الشام تتقدم يعني بشيء من السلاسة في مناطق سيطرة ما يسمى بالجيش الوطني السوري المدعوم تركيا، جيش مجهز بعتاد وسلاح تركي متطور ومتقدم. لماذا فشلت تركيا في صياغة مجموعات أو في بناء مجموعات عسكرية تابعة لها أكثر تماسكا، أكثر قدرة على مواجهة فصيل مثل هيئة تحرير الشام أو حتى متماسكة داخليا، لأن الجماعات المدعومة تركيا أصلا يعني هناك اقتتالات داخلية فيما بينها، آخرها كان اقتتالات دموية في منطقة رأس العين. ما هو وجه الضعف في هذه الجماعات المدعومة تركيا؟
So Turkey was in building the SNA using components that already existed on the ground. These are almost all the factions that make up the SNA today existed in 2017 within the Euphrates Shield areas. And I think Turkey did not want to use the resources that it would have taken to completely build a new force by scratch, and also didn't want to alienate the commanders on the ground that already had significant followings. And it just might not have had the legitimacy and the power overall to remove these commanders from the factions. And in the end, it's meant that these factions are all led by individuals. I think you can use the word warlords pretty accurately. And these commanders are all sort of jealous of each other's power and use their military power to exploit the economy and the local civilians. So I think the project was doomed from the beginning because the power of these individual commanders and Turkey's unwillingness to take power away from them.
كرر الرئيس التركي أردوغان قبل أسبوع تهديداته بشن عمل عسكري جديد ضد قوات سوريا الديمقراطية في الشمال السوري. هل تسمح حالة الاقتتال الداخلي بين القوات المسلحة المدعومة تركيا وحالة الاقتتال الحالية مع هيئة تحرير الشام لتركيا يعني خيار شن عمل عسكري ضد قسد في شمال شرق سوريا؟
I think that this situation right now, the fighting between the 3rd Legion on one hand and Hamza and Amshed and HDS on the other does prevent Turkey from launching a operation in the short term. I mean, I wouldn't rule out in the long term another operation against the SDF by Turkey and its proxies, but currently with the situation within the SNA sort of prevents that. But I think that the real impediment to the Turkish operation is still the opposition from Russia, from the US, from Iran, that all prevented Erdogan from moving earlier in the year.
نادرا ما تدخلت الولايات المتحدة عسكريا ضد هيئة تحرير الشام أو ضد نفوذ القاعدة بشكل عام في سوريا حين كان محصور في إدلب فقط. ولكن كيف ممكن أن تتصرف اليوم الولايات المتحدة أمام هذا الطموح لدى هيئة تحرير الشام بمد نفوذها في مناطق أوسع، مناطق أكثر استراتيجية في الشمال السوري وعلى الحدود التركية السورية؟ هل ممكن أن نرى صلاحيات التحالف الدولي لمقاتلة تنظيم داعش تمتد لمقاتلة هيئة تحرير الشام لمحاولة احتواء نفوذ هيئة تحرير الشام؟
Yeah, I don't foresee any sort of large-scale action by the US against HTS. I think we will see a continuation of the occasional drone strikes that take place, targeting figures that are linked to the broader global jihadi movement. But overall, the US is not invested in Syria and does not have invested to the degree that it would be able to deploy troops to fight HTS. Also, I mean, the US doesn't have a presence in the areas that HTS would be taking over within the Afrin or within the Euphrates Shield. So I just don't think it has the capacity, and I don't think it has the will to go after HTS currently.
شكرا جزيلا لك ضيفي ألكسندر ماكيفر المحقق في منظمة سوريون لأجل الحقيقة والعدالة، كنت معنا من نيويورك.
Thank you.
وختاما شكرا لكل متابعي واشنطن أونلاين، ألقاكم في حلقة جديدة الأسبوع المقبل، إلى اللقاء.